First of all, I'm just really happy to be here. This is a very beautiful city. I came here a day early just to take in the sights and get a feel for it, and it's just Baroque, Baroque, Baroque everywhere, you know? And so, first of all, I just want to thank ICAN and for everyone just convening this conference and to the crew to make this all possible. And most importantly, one of the things that you notice when you see the web page is all of the diversity of the speakers. So I think that the organizers, Beatrice, y'all did a wonderful job of really proving that, one, representation matters, but that we actually are capable of creating the policies to ensure that our world is safer. So that's just one thing that I wanted to note, and I want to shout out, that's important because when we talk about these subjects, people look at us, particularly those who look like me and look like many of the people in this room, that we're not intelligent enough to have these conversations. And so we're proving that we, in fact, are. And also wanted to, some people that are in the audience, Tina, my close friend of mine, she's from Ukraine, she's right there. And so one of my best friends, I'm really happy that she was able to come from France. Like many other people who are impacted by the war, by the invasion in Ukraine, she, like many other folks, had to flee to Europe in order to escape the violence there. And I'm really happy that she was able to attend. And there's Emma, forgive me for not remembering your last name. She's president of Plowshares Fund, and she's also in the audience. And they've been very supportive of my work, so I wanted to thank them as well. And So what I'm talking about is the war in Ukraine, and so often when we talk about the war and talking about the threat of nuclear weapons, there's this very wonky kind of pink champagne dinner room conversations with, usually a bunch of white men who think that they're too smart for the rest of us to really have these conversations, and they talk to themselves, and none of the importance of why this stuff matters is translated to us because so often they're in their kind of little bubbles and not able to really break it down to us because, quite frankly, they don't want to. And so that kind of comes down to me. How did a black guy that was born and raised in Detroit, which is the largest black city in America, who went to all black schools in Detroit, Michigan, who went to a historically black college in Little Rock, Arkansas, find himself, and not only that, too, somebody who grew up in incredible poverty, find himself on the stage in Vienna talking about Ukraine, where they don't have an indigenous, or they don't, where it's not a whole bunch of black people there, but also talking about these issues of nuclear weapons, where we're often shut out of this conversation, and talking about how all these pieces matter. So, before I talk to you about how I really got into this field, how I developed my expertise in Russia, and from there moved in Russia and Ukraine, and then moving on into nuclear weapons, I'll just get to the news peg about being in Ukraine. So, interestingly enough, I was in Ukraine, and by the way, I was there in 2009 after I finished my graduate studies and went there as a Fulbright scholar. But I was in Ukraine in January of this year to start a tourism business, of all things, right? Bringing more people from America to Ukraine. Obviously, I'm going to have to put those plans on hold, for many unfortunate reasons. But, war and dealing with violence is hell. It's pure, unadulterated hell, and it's something that no human being should ever experience. On February 24th, me and millions of other people in Ukraine woke up to explosions. And when you're in that situation, you pretty much pray that a cruise missile doesn't hit you. And you also hope that you're able to keep your mind. One of the first things that happens to a civilian in these situations is you lose your faculties in many respects. You go into shock. One of the first feelings that I had during this war, beyond during the reporting, was, am I going to make it out alive? And you feel like you're floating. You hear these explosions. You think about your friends. You think about your family. Over the first few days, your friends text you in the morning, not by saying good morning, but are you alive? This war, for me, was not one where I was a journalist that was coming from CNN or any of the other major networks, helicoptering in and doing a story, staying for 2 to 3 weeks or a month, and then eventually going back home to my cozy environment here back in the States. I had been in this country for more than 10 years, and these were my friends who I considered family, and you also wonder, is everyone going to be alive? Is everyone alive? And so there was a very personal state that I had when I was covering what was happening in Ukraine. But there was something more troubling that happened before this war started. And for many people who don't understand Russian at any level, perhaps this may not really hit you, but it was the way in which Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke about Ukrainians. When I talk about Russia-US relations or Russia-Ukraine relations back home, I'll have to be very direct with you. First, a lot of people are surprised to see a black person actually coming with the expertise, and the first thing they ask me, hey, how did you get there? But beyond that, they want me to break it down for them, and they say, well, Russians and Ukrainians, aren't they like brothers? Aren't they the same group of people? And so for a lot of the American population, these are just two, quote unquote, two different types of white people going at each other. And in America, we think that all white people get along, you know? And what was really interesting about those conversations was that I was able to draw on my own experience of being a black person who deals with oppression in my own country and understanding the experiences of the Polish immigrant, of the Jewish immigrant, and how the racial structure was established in our own country. And that really helped me to understand the racialification of how Putin viewed his neighbors in Georgia and Ukraine and the Baltics and elsewhere. And so as I was explaining to American audiences about what Putin was saying, it shocked them. So for example, and this really gets back to the point of why we all are here and why all the pieces matter. It's a phrase from one of my favorite all-time television shows, The Wire. And Detective Friedman said all the pieces matter when he was talking about connecting crime to the street and to politics. And one of the first things that Putin started doing was he started denigrating Ukrainians. Your country does not exist. It should not exist. He referred to Crimean Tatars, which is a minority Muslim population, as Islamic terrorists. He wasn't even trying to hide his disdain for the Ukrainian people. He started last summer with an ahistorical analysis of Russian-Ukrainian relations, all of which was done to erase the essence of who Ukrainians are as human beings. So of course, after a few days in which the Russian military wasn't able to occupy Kyiv and take over the government, and they weren't viewed as liberators by the Ukrainian people, naturally, Putin said that we have to consider the use of nuclear weapons, or more specifically, tactical nukes, as if there's something tactical about a nuclear warhead with anywhere from 20 to 30 kilotons of yield, but another story. There's a point to that. If your country doesn't exist, what does it mean for me to threaten to nuke you out of existence? And I think that gets back to the core issue of why this is so important, is that in a world in which you have a leader like President Putin, and there are many other leaders who exist, who do terrible things, but we're talking about the Ukraine war right now, is that anytime someone views their foreign policy through colonialism, there's no weapon that person will take off the table in order to achieve their goals. If you look around much of eastern Ukraine, for example, you see that the artillery, Mariupol, for example, parts of Kyiv region, other regions in the east, they're just pretty much being reduced to rubble. If you feel that these lands belong to you, you feel you can destroy them however you wish. And when you think about nuclear weapons, it's not only a matter of the destruction that they cause. There's a privilege behind it. There's no irony in the fact that most of the countries around the world that are considered nuclear powers have a colonial past and present. That's a fact. But one of the things that this threat did in Ukraine was that it added further fear and anxiety. Just imagine every day on your television screen, you hear one of the most powerful leaders in the world not only say you don't exist, but if you do not bow down to us, we'll nuke you. And so for me, being in that environment, what I really learned was that, there are several things that happened. The families were displaced. People who were just going about their day-to-day lives, all of a sudden, husbands had to stay and fight. Women and children had to flee the country. And so families were completely torn apart. And it was my first time experiencing that. And I really, for me, even with all the challenges of being a Black American in the United States, that was a very difficult thing for me to view, especially that many of these people were my own friends. And many of you saw me with a friend, Andre, take people back and forth from Kyiv and other places to the border. Not only though does violence and the threat of violence create destruction, the lead up creates chaos, it tears away families, and some of those families will be left with trauma and shock for the rest of their lives. And so, as I started talking to the American people about what I saw, I started connecting the pieces. Essentially, what nuclear power states like Russia does is that they do something that I haven't experienced within America. It's called redlining, where you're politically, economically, and socially written out of any power whatsoever, or very little of it. It happens across the United States of America. It happened in the past. It happens in the present. Putin is essentially doing the same thing to Ukraine. Different situations, different groups of people, but it's the same abuse of power. And you have somebody with nuclear weapons who's deciding that if my conventional military doesn't work, I will use my conventional weapons to beat you into submission. This not only impacts Ukraine, it impacts the rest of the world. We all saw that Biden said that there would be a swift response if Russia dares to use tactical nukes. Why should this all matter to us, though, right? And to those who are online, why should you care? People often ask me, I work a lot in Black media, why should Black people care? Why should anyone else care? The first thing I say is that for whatever reason, if Putin decides to launch an ICBM into the United States of America, if he feels that NATO is a threat, they're not going to say, well, you know what, though, y'all Black, we just going to leave y'all alone. nuclear weapons don't work like that. Or if you're a Latinx person, or if you are from wherever you're from, nukes do not discriminate. And so one of the main things that I know about my role and why it's so important is, and why representation in this field matters, is that so often we have been shut out of these conversations that we ourselves have convinced each other that we don't belong. And I could tell you, as a person that grew up dirt poor in Detroit, who had no access to privilege whatsoever, and finally am in these tables as a foreign correspondent and as a national political reporter at the highest levels, those men, who are usually white men, who in their very kind of sarcastic ways that I've experienced and many people in this room have probably experienced, who kind of tell you that maybe you don't know anything or maybe you don't really get the issues, I can tell you from firsthand experience that they're not that bright. They have exposure, they have good old boy networks that put them in the room, but they're no smarter than you. And what I try to prove every day is that our experience matters. Nuclear weapons discussions and the importance of us being in the room comes from our experience by simply saying that we don't want them here. We don't have to be a physicist. We don't have to be at the highest levels of government to justify our space in the room. And that's why I have to repeat that I'm happy that everyone is here, because you're entitled to being here. It is your human right to be here. So I'll give you all a little bit before I close out about how I got into nuclear weapons journalism. After the election of Donald Trump, whose name I'll only repeat once, a military site reached out to me that was connected to a site called Gawker, which no longer exists, reached out to me and said, Terrell, we like your international experiences, we like your perspective, please write about the military for us. I had never written about the military. And so I said, okay, I thought it would be fun, stretch out, get out of my comfort zones. And so I started writing about platforms like the F-16 and, Abrams tanks, all these things. And I started looking at, okay, this costs $50 million, this costs $100 million, and there is a modernization that was approved under the Obama administration for $1 trillion. Meanwhile, for some reason, people back in my hometown are sick and they can't have health care, but okay. And then one of the things I didn't know, and I was totally unprepared for, was that there is a geeky culture around the gear and the mechanics of military platforms. And that people looked at tanks and fighter jets like they were fixing their own cars or something. No disrespect, but I just found that to be kind of weird and gross, and here's why. I was really, the more I learned about military and its usage, and mostly who had the most powerful militaries, who controls them, and also nuclear weapons, the more that I was shocked and really I was shocked and I was horrified by them. And I said, oh my God, these things should not exist. And the more I started writing about this, the more the audience, which was used to somebody that was really kind of had a fetish for these platforms, the more they turned against me. I said, maybe I should not be in this particular space where I'm just writing about the mechanics of these platforms, and started focusing more on why they shouldn't exist. Long story short, I was transferred to the political division in my company, and I covered national and local elections. But I never stopped writing about nuclear weapons, in fact. I became fascinated with them. I became fascinated with the physics, the science, the whole 9 yards. And what I learned was that for each use or the threat of them, they came from some state that has some kind of colonial history and past, or where these weapons were tested, the Marshall Islands being the main example, they were the most marginalized people. And I started asking myself, why don't people from the Marshall Islands and people from Kazakhstan, people from the places that are most impacted by violence, be at the front, be at the head of the room discussing this? And so one of the lessons that I've learned as a journalist, whether it's covering war in Ukraine or writing about nuclear weapons and why treaties and why various treaties should be implemented, why New START needs to be renegotiated when the time comes, is that when we think about the pathology of violence, the people who administer it don't look like me, and the people who suffer from its use, from its testing, often do. And so I started really getting passionate about tweeting about it, doing Twitter spaces about it, writing op-eds about it. And I ran into some opposition from people who essentially told me that I don't know all the facts, I don't know all the issues. And so you started seeing this whole dynamic where people were saying that, Terrell, maybe you don't know what you're talking about, and there is some resentment there. And that usually discourages people because they don't have the institutional support to go down the path that's righteous. And Cornel West says this often, that basically the righteous path is the most difficult one. And when I started writing about Ukraine, when I talked about colonialism and the racism of Putin, there are a lot of people in the field who told me that I was speaking gibberish. Interestingly enough, when Putin literally said that Ukraine should not exist, and when he starts comparing himself to the great Russian rulers of the past, everything that I said 6 years ago makes sense. But here's the thing, it wasn't just me that knew this, we all knew it. But we've been so disempowered by these structures that beat us down and tell us that we don't have a place, that unfortunately many of us believe it. And that's no different when you're covering local politics, where people who are most affected by decisions don't feel that they are empowered to correct the wrongs of their society in which they live. And I'm very happy to be here and to remind all of us that we, in fact, do have that power. We do, in fact, have the capacity with our experiences to translate the world for ourselves, to empower each other with the knowledge so as to make better choices about the world in which we live. Because there will be people in this room who will decide the fate of our country, decide the fate of the communities in which we live. And so I leave you with these encouraging words that everything that you want, the world that we believe in, is possible, and that we are capable of executing all the goals of a nuclear-free world. Thank you all very much, and I'll be open to your questions at this time.
Thanks so much, Terrell. What an incredible and humbling story that you told right now about your experience in the Ukraine. And I'm sure that the audience has a lot of questions for you. I see that some are already coming in, and I'm gonna head right to the first question, which is, how did Ukrainians react to the nuclear threat in your perception? Did it make a difference to them, or was the horrors of conventional war so overwhelming that it didn't add any extra fear?
Oh, thank you for that question. So in regards to how Ukrainians responded to Putin's threat of nuclear war, it was two-pronged. So they were equally terrified because they've been living with these threats for years. And one of the things that Western audiences, particularly audiences that are not really keeping up with Russian language news, is that this is not the first time that Russia has threatened to use nuclear weapons towards Ukrainians. again, it just doesn't start with the nuclear weapons. It's the degradation as human beings that they have experienced. And so if you go to Dmitry Medvedev's telegram, he literally speaks about Ukrainians as if they're roaches. We need to exterminate them. They don't exist. So it doesn't matter the method that he threatens on his telegram or any other platform. During the time that I was there, the conventional war, pretty much munitions, cruise missiles, Iskander missiles, et cetera, were their primary threats because that's what they were being impacted by. I could tell you that I myself, when I was covering issues with the Territorial Defense Unit, there were a few times where I barely missed air-to-ground missiles. In one instance, the only reason why I wasn't in a location where a MiG-29 hit our location was because I had forgotten something back at my apartment with Andre. We went back and then returned, and as we were approaching our checkpoint, the missile hit. And we were roughly about 200 meters away, or maybe less. But if we had not left, I likely would have been hit. And as you all know, anybody who knows anything about war, a lot of times it's not the blasts that hit you, it's the shrapnel. And so I was there covering that. And so definitely, as far as nuclear weapons go, they were equally terrified by it. And so the real question was, which one is going to hit us first? And so that was always something that people thought about.
Wow, what a terrifying experience, and we're grateful to have this insight. And everything you said, I think for me, well, let's look at another question here. Because, oh yes, this question sort of speaks to what I was thinking about, and your framing around colonialism and the impunity of colonialism is actually something we're going to set up our next panel quite well, in fact, but that you set up so starkly for us. And also the parallels between Russia and the US in their perception of who they are threatening and who are the targets. And so I see this question here is very on point with this. Could you talk a little bit more about the colonialism issue? And how are people reacting to that? Is it different for younger people and older people? I suppose they mean in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a good question. So a basic rundown of colonialism. One thing that a lot of Americans in DC hate when I talk about is when I compare America and Russia. We're going to cut past the BS. America and Russia have imperial past and imperial presence. It's just a fact, okay? And so I'm not going to be the American that comes and speak about Russia and not critique America's own complicity in world violence, right? There are differences, but they both are imperial nations. Now, talking about the colonialism element of it, it's important to note that with Ukraine, when you think about the colonization of Ukraine, it started with Catherine the Great, right? Moved in, and then with Crimea during the late 1780s, Crimea, which was a majority Muslim region. And then after Catherine the Great's reign, Russians were repopulated to this region as well as to the east of Ukraine. Another important factor is that much of Pale of Settlement, which is where Catherine the Great settled Jews over, through racist policies, was Ukraine. So Ukraine is exhibit A of a colonized state, right? And so another thing about Russia is that it has what you call its own internalized colonization. Russia is the largest landmass country in the world, but when you think about Siberia, which everyone associates with Russia, it's not indigenous Russian land. It was indigenous people who were conquered through genocide, much how America committed genocide against its own indigenous people. The histories are connected here. They're very much connected. And so what I do with that is I draw parallels so that we can understand each other, and that if we really want to do some real internal truths, we have to ask ourselves this: why is it that power has to be conducted through hierarchies, and why can't we think more about the plurality of power? Plurality meaning that we all have equal stakes because no one should be dominating over anyone. And what is it in human nature that really makes us feel like we have the right to use force and violence to commit those causes? And both countries have a history of that. And I bring those together and draw similarities so that we can figure out solutions of how we can better move on from that frame of thought to more plurality.
Thanks so much, Terrell. I think looking at the time, we're not going to take any more questions, but Terrell is also going to be around tomorrow on the program at 1 p.m. at the Vienna Hub, so we'll have even more opportunity to ask questions then. Thanks so much, and I think with this I'll hand it over to Seth for our next session.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terrell.